Hi, my name is Professor James Hopkins. Thank you for spending this moment to listen to my introduction to a topic that I've been working away on for quite a number of years now. Before I begin, let me also mention that I've provided a couple of links to some previously recorded materials that will also, I think, assist in putting a puzzle together for you. So because this presentation is for the tribal water law class, what I would like to focus on is the significance and paramount nature of water in the lives of a client group that I've been working for in Sonora, Mexico, the Rio Yaqui Pueblos, of which there are 8 formally recognized pueblos along the historic pathway of the Rio Yaqui. You're also getting a fortunate behind-the-scenes look at my production studio. I'm kidding. In the time of this pandemic, everyone has had to make adjustments, and you'll see the green screen in the back for the recordings that I have to do. You'll actually see my early experimentation with the green screen in the 2 video links that I provide. But getting back to the topic, part of the challenge in talking about this subject matter is that it involves a lot of geography. So in the videos that I've provided, which are approximately 15 minutes or less each, there are a couple of useful maps. The main map is really, the most useful map is really the Rio Yaqui Basin. So let's just spend the first couple of minutes situating ourselves as to where we're focusing on and how it's relevant to, for example, to Tucson, Arizona. Okay, so the 8 Rio Yaqui Pueblos are situated along the pathway of the Rio Yaqui in Sonora, Mexico. The pathway of that river system ends in the Sea of Cortez along the foreshore of the Rio Yaqui Valley. So the Rio Yaqui Valley is a historic and famous valley in the history of Mexico. About from Tucson in terms of driving, probably 8 hours of solid driving. It's immediately west of the city of Obregon, which used to be the capital city a long time ago, decades, if not over a century ago, for the state of Sonora. So Obregon is the second largest city in Sonora, and it sits in the lower mid portion of the state of Sonora, which is really like a long sliver that hugs the coastline. And Sonora also has the Sierra Madres, and there's names for these sub-ranges that branch out, but the Sierra Madres are famous for their island ecological systems. And that is also relevant to the Yaqui territory. So just to quickly summarize, the Rio Yaqui Valley, this depression in the earth, it begins right around the city of Obregon on the west side. And that's where the historic pathway of the Rio Yaqui in its final approach to the Sea of Cortez can be found. There has been a lot of tinkering with the Rio Yaqui in and around Obregon, such that the Rio Yaqui no longer flows. So one of the hardest things for people to realize, first and foremost, is that the historic maps, and you'll see a slide, for example, from Father Kino going back to the 1600s. those maps do not capture the fact that the Rio Yaqui is, for all intents and purposes, in its final approach, gone. So what happens? Well, you'll see there's a map, and I will get into this in my presentation as well, and it's in the slides, of the Rio Yaqui Basin. So again, if we're in the valley at the south part of the lower Yaqui Basin, in the delta, which is the final drainage to the Sea of Cortez, where the Yaquis, the core traditional parts of their territory, are located there. Directly north, there's a dam called the Rio Yaqui, which is just northwest of the city of Obregon. That's the last southern reservoir of the Rio Yaqui, and it drains to the east in a canal that supplies the entirety of Obregon and the surrounding irrigation district, which is on the east side of the Rio Yaqui. I mean, I could spend an hour just talking about the valley and how it was basically chopped up from its original format, which was this beautiful delta. But then doing that would also put this out of focus. I apologize. There's a small focus problem. There we go. Should be resolved. All right. So the point of this little introduction is just to say that the environment, particularly as it concerns water, for the 8 Rio Yaqui pueblos, who have a population of approximately 50,000 and up. Now, that would include many of the small little towns and little very tiny pueblos in between the 8 principal pueblos. It's to say that this delta is not at all what it once was. And that's because the valley sits in what was once the largest federalized irrigation district in Mexico. And so that dam, the Rio Yaqui, really represents the final distillation of the river flow before it gets into the Yaqui indigenous territory. And so what happens is, as I mentioned, it goes to the city of Obregon. It goes also to a private irrigation district on the east side. Now, yeah, I'm just going to wreck the clock on this, and I'm sorry, but just to put this into perspective about how different everything is, the east side of the Rio Yaqui embankment is a major boundary line for an irrigation district. In the United States, there are irrigation districts, and in fact, several tribes in the Midwest have interests in both non-tribal and tribal irrigation districts. They're basically like a cooperative where farmers pool their resources with government assistance to guarantee a fixed amount of water to be delivered to their fields. And if you're growing a crop that requires flood irrigation as a matter of practice, you need an irrigation district. Crops that require flood irrigation include wheat, at least for this particular kind of climate, and also for this commercialized grain. So the heyday of the what was called the Green Revolution in the Yaqui Valley was in the post-war period. And again, on the east side of the river embankment is this district, an irrigation district. It's safe to say that the members are essentially the landed gentry of southern and central Sonora. These are old farming families. It's also important to highlight that the amount of production for agriculture and the diversity of production is very high in this area. I don't know if you ever saw the TV series, I think it's on Netflix now, Vikings. And there's this great scene where the Vikings, somehow I think they end up in southern France. And in this whole sort of chaos of the scene, they notice that things are growing This was one of the problems, a perennial problem for Vikings, which apparently explains their propensity to raiding, because they couldn't grow anything. In the Yaqui Valley, things just grow. I mean, you can see fruit trees germinating on the side of the road where maybe somebody just threw a mango off the back of a truck. So the soil is really fertile, and that's because it's the final drainage from an ancient river system, which is the Rio Yaqui, which begins way up in the Sierra Madres, right? So you will typically find rich soil and sediment deposits at the end of a what you might call a losing basin. I'm getting into different terms here in terms of hydrology and arid lands. But the water system in the Southwest typically loses volume as it moves in its sort of downward trajectory. And by that, think about the Amazon and the Amazon River and how it swells. It just gets bigger and bigger, and it collects into these, it collects from smaller inlets and grows and grows. The Rio Yaqui, as is typical in many of the rivers in the Southwest, like the San Pedro and the Santa Cruz, they don't do that. And a large reason for that is the nature of the aquifer, the nature of the subsurface and the soil. So it doesn't retain water, it loses water. And so there's some pros and cons with that. The reason why I mention that is that it's actually very easy to crash a river system in the Southwest. And that's exactly the story with Arizona, and it's the story with Sonora. So for the early part of my career in that field, I felt like a little bit of a crazy person saying that, hey, you know, the Rio Yaqui doesn't flow anymore. But actually, over time, a lot of the experts in the field said, yeah, we know. And I found a couple of scant evidence, but there were several peer-reviewed papers that supported this. So the point, though, is that the soil in this area is very rich, but as I described, there's a very delicate balance with water. So this gets back to the health of the pueblos. If you take away water, and if you, for example, you irrigate and overutilize the groundwater reserves, you deplete the subsurface groundwater reserves, and you do that quickly. So what you're left with is, again, this is not limited to Sonora. It's not a criticism strictly limited to Sonora. It happens in Arizona. Is you're left with desertification. Now, that's kind of hard to convince somebody if you're coming from the north because it all looks like desert. But typically, desertification of an arid Southwest region will be evident by the density of the soil. So I don't know if you've ever had this opportunity, but you can have this same experience in Pima County, where there's just been maybe a history of overgrazing, maybe the soil's been tilled, and certainly all of the vegetation has been torn up. Because remember, we used to have cienagas, this cienega ecology in Arizona and significant parts of Sonora, which are still prevalent in the upper basin, but in the area that I work, there is no cienega. There's no like little oasis left. So what you have is very fine soil. It's like a talc powder almost, and it picks up in the wind, and it causes enormous health problems in and around the pueblos. So when the Sonora hardwoods were present, these cottonwood species, that was less of a problem because forests create a natural buffer to particulate matter that's in drift. And instead now you have this very desolate landscape. And I'm specifically referring to the west side of the Rio Yaqui, where the Yaqui pueblos are located. And so one of the major problems in the absence of water is air quality. And so there's a long history of major upper respiratory problems. But that doesn't sort of conclude the matter, because on the west side of the riverbank, literally in and around the pueblos, are wheat fields. That area on the west side of the riverbank is known as Las Colonias Yaquis. It's an irrigation district that was set up by the federal government. I'll get into that in a moment. So you have already heard this bizarre story how there's no water. Okay, so how do they have an irrigation district on the Yaqui side of the valley where the 8 pueblos are? Well, they have it because there is an irrigation district that has access by virtue of its district status as an ejido to the remaining flow that goes past the Oviachic Reservoir. And so what happens is, once the Rio Yaqui hits the Oviachic Reservoir, it's really spoken for. So you have this big bowl, and the government policy dictated that it has to be distributed. The bulk goes to the east, to this private ejido district, and the city of Obregon and the surrounding area. And then the remainder goes through a canal system, a lined delivery canal system, into the Yaqui irrigation district. But that is not a Yaqui owned or managed district. It is not, or it should not be viewed as a manifestation of self-governance. Some of you listening to this, if you made it this far, might remember the late Rodolfo Stavenhagen. He was a preeminent jurist and scholar in the field of indigenous rights. I believe his background was heavily involved with anthropology. I had the opportunity to meet him actually when he was in his role as a special rapporteur. His master's thesis was in Spanish, and it focused on the demise of the Yaqui irrigation district. So why did this situation occur? And to be clear, what you have now are 8 pueblos. The majority of them are legally categorized as unincorporated barrios by the Federal Electricity Commission that sends an invoice for electricity to one unlucky person in each pueblo who has to go door to door to collect the communal amount of pesos to pay the bill, or else the electricity is cut off, and it literally is. So how did this kind of mess happen? Well, one of the ways to explain it, as Rodolfo Stavenhagen did, was to look at a very, very important piece of history in Mexico and the United States. So, just to quickly summarize, we know that the Yaqui Valley is part of a binational basin. It's called the Rio Yaqui Basin, or the Rio Yaqui Aquifer. I'm filling in some blanks here too that you'll see on the maps. We know that the northern or upper part of the basin goes into southeastern Arizona, and also southwestern New Mexico, and it has its own distinct underground water managing district called the Yaqui Water District. We know that this is a story that is totally disjointed thematically. For example, Arizona and New Mexico probably don't realize that they have a shared groundwater resource from a binational basin. They individually will know that, but they probably don't talk to each other. In fact, they don't, because they have different systems of groundwater law at the state level. We know that the Sierra Madres kind of emerge in the kind of center part of this region. So between New Mexico and Arizona, and then when you're going into Sonora, and then with Chihuahua on the east, it becomes extremely mountainous, and we have this rich sky island ecology. We also can understand that basins drain, and typically when they drain, all this ancient volcanic soil and activity with mineralization deposits can result in amazing soil. And that was the case with the Yaqui Valley. It should also be mentioned that in the upper part of the basin, there is, until recently, the largest copper lode in North America, and for a period of time until recently, the world. And that's the Cananea-Caridad copper lode. If you take public lands and mining, it's an interesting course. You'll find this map, you can look it up on Google, regarding the copper deposits in Arizona, which are sizable. And you'll notice that there's this big, huge break. And then as you move to the east of the state, it really picks up again, the deposits. And that's why you have Bisbee, for example. Well, that deposit base extends into Mexico. And in fact, it is much bigger in Sonora. Sonora really has much more in the way of copper than Arizona. And in Arizona, it's huge. Arizona was, for a time, the largest. It might still be the largest copper producing state. But the Yaquis actually have had a huge history in the mining sector in Sonora and parts of Arizona, going back to New Spain. I won't get into that too much here, but it's important to understand that the Yaquis really moved historically throughout the basin. And think about it for a moment. If you're from the north, where rivers were really like highways, the same applied when you're looking in the arid southwest. If you had a river system, it was going to make a path through mountains for you. There would be access to water, food, etc. And so there's a history of movement by the Yaquis that goes into southeastern Arizona. And, well, we can talk about that later. Let's go back to Rio Yaqui at the lower part of the Yaqui Basin. So what Rodolfo Staufenhagen was describing, and it was important that I describe the topography to you, because Rodolfo Staufenhagen was describing a period of transformation in Mexico, and specifically it begins with the regime of President Lázaro Cárdenas. I'm not going to do justice to describing Lázaro Cárdenas, but it's important to understand that he really shaped an opinion of the Yaquis when he fought them directly in the Mexican Revolutionary War. And he made very, very clear notes after one engagement in a border city called Naco, which was held by the Yaquis at the time because that was a copper depot for copper going out into the United States, which would then end up in Los Angeles, where it would be sold. So if you controlled Naco, you also were an effective gatekeeper for the inflow of foreign direct investment, which was not done by ATM or bank machine. It was done by stagecoach and some form of currency, such as silver. So the Mexican government actually had to take that back because the Yaquis had taken it over. And Lázaro Cárdenas was a young general at the time and made a note that he never wanted to fight them again because it was such a horrible experience. One of the things Lázaro Cárdenas does, and I'm really going down a rabbit hole here, but you're going to have to know this. You need to know this if you want to know your American history. So when does Lázaro Cárdenas come up, right, as the president of Mexico? It's 1936. So what's happening in Europe? There's fascism. You have the German Socialist Party on the rise, the Nazis. And there's deep concern in the language of Cárdenas because he's talking about nationalizing all surface and subsurface rights. At the time, prior to Lázaro Cárdenas, Mexico had been enormously unstable and was well known for being a target of foreign direct investment, particularly by Americans, specifically for its resources. So Lázaro Cárdenas comes into power, and he says in 1936, "Hey America, I'm going to liberate Mexicans from the oppression of foreign direct investment." Specifically, he's thinking Standard Oil. And most countries, unlike the United States, have nationalized natural resources. Their default is that resources like water are part of the national patrimony. Mexico made that radical transformation in 1936 with amendments to the Constitution that nationalized all natural resources as being part of the nation's patrimony. So this effectively expropriated private oil well rights and particularly impacted a number of Americans, including Standard Oil. So why is this relevant? It's relevant because the Americans were terrified right at the presidential level that if Germany went to war, they would have a sympathetic country at their border in the way of Mexico. So this required some attention. So that's my polite way of skipping over a lot of history, but just so you understand, by 1937, the United States is seized with this fear that Mexico is going to side with Nazi Germany. So amazingly, how does Cárdenas feint his move to the United States to give them comfort? There's a number of things that he does that are really remarkably, I think, intelligent. One of them is he signals, and this is evidenced in a cable from the ambassador. So right at the U of A, you can actually go and look up the ambassadorial cables that were going back and forth between the United States and Mexico. And he signals through his legal representative and then through the ambassador that the Americans will be very happy with the way he's going to deal with Standard Oil, and he has a big announcement to make in terms of the Yaquis and how he's going to treat them. In other words, he's signaling that if you follow me on how I treat the Yaquis, you're going to really like what I do with Standard Oil. And so he makes this declaration in 1937 that sets aside the Yaqui Valley in direct consultation with the 8 pueblos, and that's where you get Los Ochos Pueblos. That's where you get the 8 pueblos, because they sign this decreto, this decree by President Cárdenas in 1937, and it gives them, drum roll, so if you're hopefully not too bored, but if you can understand, based on the whole description that I just gave you, what makes this so important is that in 1937, Lázaro Cárdenas, in the decree, promises them, the Yaquis, 50% of the surface flow of the Rio Yaqui, plus all additional volume, surface flow that's necessary and for cultural purposes. So just to summarize, 1937, Lázaro Cárdenas, in consultation with the 8 pueblos, signs a decree. The decree gives 50% of the surface flow to the Yaqui pueblos. It also gives additional volume for as-needed purposes, including cultural purposes. Immediately after this process, he turns to what would later be like the Department of the Interior and the Department of Agriculture and the Federal Water Department, known as Cadagua, to modernize the valley. And it doesn't happen. This is where Staffenhagen's I think work is so valuable. Something similar to allotment happens. Basically, instead of having like a beneficial interest in land, what you get is a beneficial interest in the ejido system. And there's a series of deliberate efforts made by the kind of landed gentry who felt excluded to set up local banks, for example, that would effectively bankrupt these ejidos with very onerous and unconscionable terms to their loans. These farmers in the ejido system were set to quotas by the government. And then the idea was, well, we're going to help you assume the risk of meeting those quotas by giving you lines of credit. And so you go to the bank, you get the loan, and there was just a ton of fraud that happened and foreclosures on the actual equipment, etc. So many of these small cooperative farm units collapsed very quickly, such that the Yaquis, and this is Staffenhagen's conclusion, ended up becoming workers on their own land. And so they would rent out the land to other ejido groups. One thing I wanted to mention about the ejidos is after the NAFTA, the Mexican government amended the ejido laws to allow a more private landlord-tenant style of relationship to develop in the ejido model, whereas previously it was just very, very intensely government-related. The only thing I could think of that's similar is the ANSCA, the Alaskan Native Corporation model, because you don't have an equitable interest potentially in the company, in the organization, but not in the land or the resources. So the Cardenas Decree is pivotal because it's like a treaty and it speaks to water. I could go on at length, but what you need to understand, hopefully by now, is that none of these promises were kept. And there's a number of really pivotal pieces of history. But I think I'm going to stop right now because I've spoken for quite a while. And I don't know if this is recorded properly. So let me summarize quickly by saying the following. So the Yaquis are on the Yaqui Basin. You know that by now. They're in the lower basin in the delta. The delta has crashed ecologically. There's no water. There's a massive water problem there. They are a large population, minimum estimate at 50,000. They have at least one treaty that I've shared with you. And there is always the perennial problem of not enough water. And you have a river system that's been over allocated. In the north, it courses through some of the most mineral rich areas for silver and gold and copper. And again, in my experience, usually you'll find all of these precious metals kind of clumped together. And that's just a result of the geomorphology that occurs to result in these deposit finds. So you have like ancient volcanoes, etc. And that was a horrible geography explanation, but essentially you have these ancient seams of precious metals that have been pooled together by similarly ancient hydrological events. And in the drainage, you will have a really good accumulation of sediment deposits that are very, very supportive of agriculture. And that's why you have people living there. So, okay, so I'm going to end it there. Because hopefully, at a minimum, that's what you can use as you go through these two other videos. There's a third video link. It's short, it's 2 minutes. It shows this basin in the city of Hermosillo, which is really like the Phoenix of Sonora. It's an important economic city for Arizona. It's the commercial and industrial hub of Sonora. We think of Nogales, Sonora, as being a hub, which incidentally has over 500,000 people on the Sonora side. There's only about 30,000 people on the Arizona side, which is a very standard population contrast along the border. But Hermosillo is really going through a revitalization. So that water basin that I'm showing you is filled with water from the Rio Yaqui. I'll get into this in greater detail, but as I said, the river is over appropriated. So in 2012, the government allowed for the Aqueduct for Independence, as it's called, so the federal state government, pooled together to build 115, 120 kilometers of pipe from the middle section of the basin in a place called El Navío, which is the middle section dam. And so they moved 75 million cubic meters per annum to supply the city of Hermosillo. And again, this is in direct violation of the Yaqui water rights. And hopefully we'll talk about this. The Yaquis are so up to speed on every document. I mean, elders are like little mini librarians. They always keep these old documents, even going back to New Spain, some of them original. And so one of the interesting things, just as a digression as I sign off, one of the interesting things that I find in working in Latin America, in Spanish-speaking countries, is the indigenous groups that I've worked with are really, really proficient at keeping records, and they remember everything. And so hopefully you'll remember to ask me the question why, and the answer has to do with their style of government, which adapted over 350 years to the reality of being directly lied to. So they actually have a system of recording, and I'll speak more to that. I should stop because I'll just keep rambling on. And like I said, I just want to make sure this is recorded because I need to give you this background as you go through those 3 video clips. The short one with the reservoir in the city of Hermosillo is just to show you that they're pulling water off the Rio Yaqui in the middle part of the basin, moving it west 120, 130 kilometers, which is known in the water biz as a transboundary basin transfer. It's illegal under international customary law, and there's certainly no prescription allowing it under the basic framework of international agreements, binational agreements between the United States and Mexico. But we'll talk about that more next class. So thank you so much for your patience. I'm sorry I couldn't be there, and look forward to seeing you as we come down the finish line of an incredible semester. Thank you.